Colorado has a human trafficking crisis. It ranks among the states with the highest numbers of human trafficking reports in the country. 79% of Colorado human trafficking crimes are for the purposes of commercial sex. The city of Denver sits at the intersection of two major interstate corridors that serve as primary arteries for trafficking networks moving human beings across the state and through the region. These are not disputed statistics. They come from research compiled by the Common Sense Institute. Colorado is a documented, measurable, ongoing human trafficking disaster. So naturally, 4 Democratic members of the Colorado State Legislature decided this was the moment to introduce a bill legalizing prostitution. Democratic state senators Nick Hinrichsen and Lisa Cutter and Democratic representatives Lorena Garcia and Rebecca Stewart introduced legislation last month that its sponsors describe as decriminalizing adult commercial sexual activity. Michael Allen, a Republican candidate for Colorado Attorney General and a current district attorney, said the bill would go further than Nevada's existing prostitution law and would make Colorado the leader in the entire country on legalized prostitution. He said he was shocked. He said it does not make sense. He said the only outcome he can predict if the bill passes is continued depravity in the state of Colorado. He's right. And tonight, we're going to talk about why this bill is not a progressive policy experiment or a civil liberties question or a harm reduction initiative. It is an invitation to every human trafficking network operating in America to come to Colorado and operate freely.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
The sponsors of this bill have not responded to press inquiries. They introduced legislation to make Colorado the most permissive prostitution jurisdiction in the United States, and then declined to explain themselves publicly when asked. That silence is itself a statement. When you cannot defend what you've done in public, in plain language, to the people who elected you, you know what you've done. The bill is framed as decriminalizing adult commercial sexual activity. Language carefully chosen to present the legislation as a matter of individual liberty and harm reduction rather than what it actually is, which is the removal of the legal tools that law enforcement uses to identify, investigate, and prosecute the networks that profit from the commercial sexual exploitation of human beings. The distinction between the framing and the reality is the entire argument. When you decriminalize the transaction, you do not simply free consenting adults from unjust legal interference in their private choices. You remove the legal basis on which prosecutors build cases against the traffickers, the pimps, the networks, and the organizations that are profiting from commercial sex, many of whom are operating with victims who are not consenting, who are there because of force, fraud, or coercion, and who cannot identify themselves as victims to law enforcement because the legal framework that would protect them has been dissolved. Michael Allen has prosecutorial experience in Colorado. He understands what the bill does in practice because he has spent his career working within the legal framework it would dismantle. He said it plainly: prostitution is a natural outgrowth of human trafficking, and the links are undeniable. That is not a moral assertion. It's a prosecutorial observation. The commercial sex market and the human trafficking supply chain that feeds it are not separate industries with different participants. They are the same industry, operating at different levels of visibility. The buyer engaging in what the bill's sponsors call adult commercial sexual activity, and the trafficker moving victims across Colorado's interstate corridors are participants in the same economic transaction. Decriminalizing the retail end of that transaction does not eliminate the supply chain. It expands the market that supply chain serves. Colorado's position in the national trafficking geography makes this specific bill particularly dangerous. Allen identified the two major interstate corridors running through the state: I-25 running north-south through Denver, and I-70 running east-west, as primary arteries for trafficking networks. Denver is already, in his assessment and in the data, a hub for human trafficking concentrated in the metro area. Those corridors and that hub exist because Colorado sits at a geographic crossroads that makes it valuable to trafficking networks that move victims across regional and national supply chains, making Colorado the most permissive prostitution jurisdiction in the country. Does not just affect Colorado. It makes Colorado the destination of choice for trafficking networks operating across the entire western United States, drawing victims and demand into a state that has just removed the primary legal deterrence against commercial sexual exploitation. The argument for legalizing prostitution rests on several claims that have been tested in jurisdictions that have implemented it. The evidence does not support those claims, and the Colorado Democrats who introduced this bill are either unaware of that evidence or have chosen to ignore it. The legalization hypothesis argues that bringing commercial sex into a regulated legal framework will reduce trafficking by separating consensual adult sex work from coerced exploitation, improving health and safety conditions for people who choose to engage in commercial sex, and allowing law enforcement to focus resources on genuine exploitation rather than consensual transactions. It sounds coherent in theory. In practice, it has not worked anywhere it's been tried. Germany legalized prostitution in 2002. The result was not a contained, regulated industry of consenting adult workers separated from trafficking networks. The result was a massive expansion of the commercial sex market that drew trafficking networks from across Europe and beyond. Overwhelmed the regulatory framework designed to distinguish legal from illegal activity, and it produced a documented increase in trafficking victims entering Germany specifically because the legal market created a demand that the regulated supply could not meet. German law enforcement and academic researchers spent years documenting the failure before the country began rolling back elements of the legalization framework. The Netherlands, which has operated a legal prostitution sector in Amsterdam and other cities for decades, has similarly documented that legalization did not reduce trafficking and that, in some respects, expanded the trafficking supply chain by increasing overall demand for commercial sex. The Dutch government conducted its own reviews and implemented significant restrictions on the legal red light district, specifically because of documented evidence that the legal framework was being exploited by trafficking networks. The research that specifically examines the correlation between legalization and trafficking volumes finds a consistent pattern. Jurisdictions with legal prostitution have larger reported human trafficking inflows than jurisdictions where prostitution is criminalized. The mechanism is straightforward. Legalization expands the commercial sex market. Increased market size increases demand. Trafficking networks respond to increased demand by expanding supply. And the increased volume of both legal and illegal activity overwhelms the regulatory capacity to distinguish between the two. The people who bear the cost of that overwhelmed regulatory capacity are not the consenting adults the bill's sponsors invoke when they describe decriminalizing adult commercial sexual activity. They are the victims who entered the supply chain through force, fraud, or coercion, and who cannot identify themselves as such in an environment where the industry has been legitimized. Allen said the bill will not solve any issue happening on the ground in Colorado. It will not help with the state's budget deficit. It will not help with crime. The only outcome he predicts is continued depravity. The research on legalization in other jurisdictions supports that prediction, and it goes further. It does not just fail to solve the problem. It makes the problem worse by expanding the market that trafficking networks serve. The language of this bill, decriminalizing adult commercial sexual activity, performs a specific rhetorical function. It centers the frame on adults making choices and removes from the frame entirely the population that bears the greatest cost of the commercial sex industry. The people who are not adults making choices, who are not there voluntarily, who cannot leave, and who will be harder to identify and rescue if the legal framework that currently gives law enforcement tools to find them is dissolved. The National Human Trafficking Hotline data and research cited in the Common Sense Institute study that documents Colorado's trafficking crisis are not primarily about adults who choose commercial sex work. They are about victims. People who entered the commercial sex supply chain through recruitment under false pretenses, through debt bondage, through force applied by traffickers who understand that the commercial sex market pays well and that the legal risk of trafficking is the primary constraint on their operation. Remove the legal risk. Expand the market. The constraint disappears and the supply expands to meet the demand. The victim in a trafficking operation is not a free agent who could simply walk out when the law changes to protect her. She is controlled through debt, through violence, through the seizure of her documents, through psychological manipulation that has convinced her she has no alternative and no one who will help her. The legal framework that criminalizes prostitution is one of the primary investigative tools law enforcement uses to reach her, to make contact, to offer resources. to build the case against the person controlling her that gives her a pathway out. When that framework is removed, the contact point disappears. The investigative tool is gone. The trafficker's legal risk is reduced, and the victim remains exactly where she was. Now, in a legal environment that makes her situation harder to identify and the person exploiting her harder to prosecute. This is why Allen said the links between prostitution and human trafficking are undeniable. It's not a moral argument about the nature of commercial sex. It's a prosecutorial argument about the supply chain that feeds the commercial sex market and the legal architecture that currently allows prosecutors to disrupt that supply chain. The 4 Democratic legislators who introduced this bill are proposing to dismantle that architecture in a state that is already documenting record highs in human trafficking victims and ranking among the worst in the country for trafficking reports. Whatever their stated rationale, and they've declined to explain it publicly, the documented, predictable, research-supported outcome of their proposal is more victims, more trafficking, and fewer legal tools to help either. The children this show discussed last week, the 11-year-old found in North Carolina after 6 years hidden under a false name, the children the NCMEC works to find and recover, exist in the same ecosystem that human trafficking networks operate in. The trafficking infrastructure that moves adults through Colorado's interstate corridors also moves children. The networks that supply the commercial sex market with adult victims also supply it with minors. The legal framework that Colorado Democrats want to dismantle is the same framework that law enforcement uses to investigate and prosecute the people who traffic children. These are not separate policy areas with separate victim populations. They are the same industry, the same networks, the same legal tools, and the same victims. Some of them adults who have entered the supply chain as children and have never found a way out. Michael Allen said that after 10 years of devastatingly bad criminal justice reform, Colorado voters are ready for a Republican Attorney General. He is running to be the first one elected in more than a decade. The prostitution legalization bill, he said, demonstrates how the Democratic Party is not doing the right things on the behalf of the people of Colorado. He is correct. And the specific pattern of Democratic governance in Colorado over the past decade belongs in this episode because it is the context in which this bill was introduced and the record against which its sponsors should be judged. Colorado has spent a decade under Democratic governance implementing what that governance calls criminal justice reform. That reform has included significant reductions in mandatory minimum sentences, bail reform policies that have released violent and repeating offenders before trial, and a governing philosophy that consistently prioritizes the interests of the accused over the interests of the victims and communities bearing the cost of crime. The results are documented in the same data that documents the human trafficking crisis. Rising crime rates in Denver and other urban centers, a prosecution and conviction environment that trafficking networks have learned to navigate, and a legal landscape that has been systematically made more permissive toward criminal activity, while the communities most affected by that criminal activity have less and less recourse. The prostitution legalization bill is the logical extension of that governing philosophy applied to commercial sexual exploitation. The same ideological framework that produced bail reform, reduced sentences, and decriminalized drug possession is now being applied to the commercial sex industry with the same framing. Decriminalization as harm reduction, criminalization as oppression of vulnerable people, and the same predictable outcome. The people the framework claims to protect bear more harm, while the people exploiting them face fewer consequences. This pattern is not unique to Colorado. It's the governing philosophy of the progressive movement applied to criminal justice across every state where that movement has achieved governing authority. California implemented similar criminal justice reforms and documented similar outcomes. New York's Clean Slate Act, which I've covered on the show in my Albany episode, seals the criminal records of people convicted of serious felonies after 8 years and prohibits employers from asking about sealed records. The same ideological thread runs through all of it. The criminal justice system is an instrument of oppression. Criminalization causes harm rather than preventing it, and the solution to every crime problem is to decriminalize rather than to enforce. The victims of human trafficking in Colorado have not been consulted about whether they find that framework helpful. The women and men and children who have passed through Denver's trafficking network on their way across the country's interstate corridors did not vote on the criminal justice reform agenda that has made their exploitation easier and their rescue harder. They are the people the Democratic Party in Colorado claims to represent. Vulnerable people, marginalized people, people without power. And they are the people whose situation gets worse with every step the Democratic criminal justice reform agenda takes. That is not an accident of implementation. It's the predictable outcome of an ideology that has decided that the legal tools designed to protect vulnerable people from exploitation are themselves the problem. Allen said the bill demonstrates the Democrats are not doing the right things on the behalf of the people of Colorado. He is running to change that. The Attorney General's office, he noted, has the ability to use the statewide grand jury to investigate and prosecute trafficking crimes and hold people accountable. That is the alternative to the open floodgates the Democrats' bill would create. A state law enforcement posture that treats human trafficking as a serious criminal enterprise that it is. That uses every available legal tool to disrupt the networks and prosecute the people profiting from exploitation, and that understands the victims of those networks deserve an attorney general whose first commitment is to them, rather than to the ideological framework that has been making their situation worse for a decade. 4 Colorado Democrats introduced a bill to make their state the most permissive prostitution jurisdiction in America. Colorado already ranks among the worst states in the country for human trafficking. 79% of Colorado's human trafficking crimes are for commercial sex. Denver is a documented hub for trafficking networks using the state's major interstate corridors. The bill's sponsors have not responded to press inquiries. The bill has stalled for now, but it was introduced, it was serious, and it tells you exactly where the Colorado Democratic Party's governing priorities are. The research on prostitution legalization in other jurisdictions is clear. Legalization expands the commercial sex market. Expansion increases demand. Increased demand draws trafficking networks to meet that demand. And the victims who cannot self-identify in a legalized environment are harder to find and harder to rescue. The people the bill's framing invokes, adults making free choices, are not the people who bear the cost of that outcome. The people who would bear the costs are the victims already in the supply chain who will be harder to reach when the legal tools designed to find them are gone. Michael Allen said it plainly. The links between prostitution and human trafficking are undeniable. He is a prosecutor. He has seen those links in the case files and the grand jury proceedings and the victim interviews that produced his career. He is running to be Attorney General of a state that needs one who will use the office's full power against the networks exploiting its most vulnerable people, rather than passing bills that open the door wider for those networks to operate. Pray for the victims in those networks right now. Pray for the law enforcement personnel trying to find them. Pray for the prosecutors trying to build cases that get them out. And hold accountable the legislators who looked at Colorado's human trafficking crisis and decided the answer was to make the industry easier to operate. Stand with us, support the mission, refuse the silence. Find us at TITDUSA.com and the Stand Against the Silence campaign. I'll see you next time.